you wanted to start with transphobia and bigotry versus humour, as brought up by S-Man in your own stream with him.
Yeah? Yeah, he was referring to one of your earlier videos that you was where you opened up with the line that it is transphobic to be making transgender jokes. My question is, if somebody was to like make fun of Riley Dennis or even Blair White, for examples, how would that be? How would there be an implication of bigotry or hatred or any of that sort of stuff?
Well, when you look at the sort of humour that's often directed at trans people, often it makes fun of the entire being of the trans person. So, for instance, jokes that are like making fun of a man in a dress and saying, "Oh, this is what trans women are essentially like," help reinforce negative stereotypes and worldviews about trans people. So it's not necessarily to say, "Oh, do not make jokes about a trans person." It's more asking people to reflect on the nature of the jokes that are made, because obviously it's silly to say, "Oh, person X cannot be made fun of ever," because like that's obviously not going to happen. But the jokes of which hold a transphobic nature are ones which you're trying to avoid and examine as problematic, to use an overused word, the culture that we live in and how it reflects on those who are at the negative end of the joke, those who are being made the joke.
So, of a transphobic nature is what you have a problem with. Like, say I had a transgender friend and I just wanted to tease on about his or her transgenderism. There would not necessarily be an implication that I am intolerant nor fearful to said person.
Well, I mean, it's contextual, isn't it? Like, if in the case that you knew someone who was both transphobic and okay with humour directed towards them, that made fun of something to do with them, obviously it's just you, so it's fine. Like, obviously everyone has their limits and boundaries. It's like, for instance, like, obviously there are going to be gay people who are okay with homophobic jokes. However, on a wider context, spread around, the jokes that are made that make fun of trans people tend to punch down. Comedy that punches down isn't, I mean, yeah, fine, some people laughed at it, but ultimately it helps reinforce negative attitudes and stereotypes, especially as in the context of the wider world, where there is still a lot of genuine transphobia in society. We risk placing legitimacy to the worldview that allows trans people to be targeted and unfairly. So when you make jokes, for instance, that make fun of the idea of a man in a dress and trans women having supposedly male genitalia, you end up actually legitimizing those who actually do believe that trans women are just men in dresses, and to enact violence upon them, and to want to make laws to prohibit their rights and activities. And we risk allowing, if we just have all these jokes in society which make fun, of trans people, then you allow the transphobes and the far right to infiltrate discourse by mixing in jokes with actual insidious views. So that's essentially where I'm coming from. Like, it's okay, obviously, like if it's just having a laugh with like a mate, but in the wider context, you have to realize that there are dangers and real like problems with just having openly transphobic humor just flowing around society.
Well, I can understand that there is a certain line as far as manners go. Like, if you have a friend that just respectfully asks you to stop. Like, I have one friend who was overweight. He asked me respectfully to stop making overweight jokes at him, and I have respectfully stopped. But at the same time, I have like 3 or 4 other overweight friends that I poke at for being overweight all the time. And in return, they poke at me for being underweight because I'm a skinny ass, pretty much. And they don't really mind it that much. But if somebody was one to make fun of transgender people just in general as a group, like say for a stand-up comedy, let's say Louis C.K. or Eddie Griffin or any of those people wanted to make a stand-up about them, would that be transphobic? Would that be fearful and intolerant of transgender people?
I think it kind of would be, yeah. It'd be a bit questionable to see. So, for instance, someone like Louis C.K., a national figure when it comes to comedy, like someone who is well known, has got a large audience, they've got quite diverse group of people watching them. If their jokes are centering in on one already marginalized, often oppressed and targeted group, and sort of making jokes at their expense, then it's not really that, it's not a particularly effective comedy because it's punching down, and good comedy punches up. And plus, it doesn't, again, like I said, it doesn't help the already pretty poor situation regarding trans status and rights in society, because it helps legitimize actual transphobic views about trans people. And like in a perfect world, yeah, everyone would be able to have a laugh about things about themselves, and just it wouldn't matter in the context of society. But when it comes to like the real world, transphobia is still a thing, and the jokes that are told actually hold true to what people actually think about trans people. It's like it's like with racist jokes and sexist jokes. Like you can argue, oh well, they're just jokes, but at the same time, people hold the views in real life. Hence why it's poor taste to make many of the jokes. And with trans people especially, where in many parts of the world, even in fact not even a case of even in quite a lot of the Western world, like they're still only just getting even basic recognition. In many parts of America, trans people lack quite a few equality and discrimination protection acts and stuff. So it's like the fight is still going on to have them validated and recognized as actual people. So comedy that's just like making fun of them and taking a bit of a joke at them, it's like, well, it's not helping the climate for them. They're still being oppressed. And if you're just sort of making a laugh at them, then it's sort of like, what does that say about the way you view them if like they haven't even achieved equality?
Well, I think that my literal words would explain it. Like, if I was explaining my own ideology, would explain my views on LGBT people more than just a simple joke. Like, I think, in my opinion, it takes a whole lot more than jokes to be affirming hateful ideologies, be it anti-LGBT, anti-Black, anti-Asian, or anti-man, anti-woman, whatever have you.
Well, of course, yeah. Obviously, it's not just the jokes which are the problem, but the jokes, like at core, focus in on something which is negative to be made fun of. So like I think I can't remember who said it, but someone said that comedy requires misery of some form to be funny. There needs to be someone suffering for the joke to work. And if the thing that is negative, which is being the source of the comedy, is literally just the fact that a trans person exists, or a trans person is not exactly the same as most people, then that suggests something a bit questionable about the joke. And well, yeah, you can say, oh well, just because people tell jokes doesn't mean they have to have that means they're hateful towards groups. And yeah, that can be true. People can be perfectly fine with a group of people and still make jokes at their expense. But ultimately, underlying that, there are problems with that, because if you're able to make these jokes and not realize the harm they're doing, then you are like sort of expressing a bit of a naivety about the situation we're in. Like, ultimately, like, what is more important than making jokes which humor you are the protection and status of trans people. And in the society we live in, where there are lots of transphobes, and that is just natural, like, fact. Essentially, you only have to go as far as like typing in like 2 genders on YouTube, and you just see the sort of responses and attitudes you'll find. Yeah, the jokes that are told allow entry and allow validity to transphobes trying to sort of disrupt and harm trans people.
So what was that you said about naivety on the subjects being connected to the jokes?
So it's like if you have the like attitude that, oh well, I'm not transphobic or homophobic or whatever, but let me tell my jokes about them because I'm not hateful. It's like, well, yeah, fine, you may well say you're not homophobic, but you're telling jokes which are like identical to the actual views of the people who are being transphobic, and sort of not considering the real world effect they have. Like if you have just openly like bigoted jokes being told, it doesn't really matter what you think internally. What is being heard and what is being broadcast by public figures and stuff are the transphobic jokes. And as a result, you just have all this negative, like transphobic language and the rhetoric being thrown around, and it becomes indistinguishable from the truth. It's like, for instance, if you imagine like in the 1920s in Germany, like telling jokes about Jews, someone could well say, "Oh, well, I'm not anti-Semitic. I just like telling jokes. It's just a joke." But at the same time, you've got the growing far right and the growing like problem with Nazism in that time. And it's like,
Well,
if
you
you
got to
would,
see what the man's actions are that actually reflect his ideologies. Like, is he joking about Jews, but at the same time, he is fighting against the Holocaust and other Nazi movements?
well, no, I meant it was a hypothetical. Like, I meant if you have someone telling anti-Semitic jokes, it doesn't, like, in the context of the build up towards Nazi Germany, the Weimar Republic, like, it's not helpful because obviously there's a lot of that going on at the time. Like, it's the same thing applies today. Like, people are trying to invalidate and attack trans people. In fact, I'm pretty sure crime rates against trans people are rising. So having all these jokes about like trans people just sort of floating around is unhelpful. And someone can say, "Oh, well, I would stand up for trans people if it came to it," but you're making it worse for trans people by allowing these jokes to infiltrate society.
It isn't helpful, but at the same time, it isn't in of itself harmful as well.
But it is, because it normalizes the language that transphobes use. Like, it takes something which isn't a negative, which isn't like bad, and makes it something that it has unnecessary ridicule, and thus gives ammunition and momentum to the transphobes who are trying to attack trans people. So it is harmful.
It gives momentum, huh?
Yeah. Well, if you have like the points you're making just sort of said anyway as quote unquote jokes, like it's going to allow you entry in, because then suddenly you now have the tools to say what you want, and you can either blend it in as jokes but then also sort of mean it at the same time. And you end up with trans people feeling like ostracized and uncomfortable with themselves because of all the negative things being said about them as supposedly jokes. And then mixed into all that is like legitimate abusers who can sort of masquerade somewhere between the two. And then obviously legitimate abusers who will just say what they want when they want and feel pretty like incentivized to do it. And like, that's not the attitude sort of approach we want to have. We don't need to be, there's nothing bad about mocking a trans person just for being trans. And in the climate we have, I don't think it's particularly healthy to be defending jokes of a transphobic nature.
I can conceive that jokes of any kind can be badly timed, but a transgender joke or a racial joke, does that in of itself make the said person a transphobe or a racist, hateful towards said group?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, like, I suppose like directly no, but it's never as simple as that, is it? Like, you wouldn't. I don't think you can just say like, oh well, if you believe X, then you are racist, and if you therefore X not being believed means you're not racist. Like, it's not, racism isn't just like a binary and stuff. Like, so, for instance, people like moderates, for instance, or quote unquote moderates, like at the time of the civil rights movement, they may well be completely fine. They'll be like, oh, well, black people should have rights, but if they say nothing, if they still tell the jokes which like the genuine racists say, then like, what does that help? If you're like using the language and reinforcing the stereotypes and rhetoric of transphobes, then how does that help trans people at all? What use are you as an ally to trans people if you help and aid the language of transphobes more than you do trans people? If you make jokes at Riley J. Dennis's expense, like, and the jokes are essentially just referring to her trans status and her like physical body and stuff, then it doesn't matter what you actually think of her. You're enabling those who abuse and harass Riley to be incentivized to do more. And it's like, well, like, how can you honestly say that you are not transphobic and not aiding transphobes if like you're happy with and even participating in jokes which just reaffirm transphobic views of society? Like, I think it's important to keep coming back to the fact that these jokes do nothing but harm trans people because they contribute to a culture of transphobia and enable transphobes to spread their message.
So yes or no, is making racial or trans jokes make the person a bigot?
Well, it's not as simple as that. Like, I mean, obviously, I understand, but like, you're asking for an answer, but I'm trying to like explain it. Like, it's there's no point just asking, oh, if I ask question X, then am I this? Like the person who is making transphobic jokes, yeah, you could say they are being transphobic. And as to whether
So
are they a
so
transphobe?
I make a transgender joke, I instantly fear Blair White and I fear Riley Dennis.
See, I feel as though you're coming at this
Because
from
that's what a phobia
different.
is. A phobia is a fear of said noun.
Well, yeah, but in the sense of this context, it's obviously got a bit more meaning to it. Like, or if you whittle it down to like the one definition it has, then yeah, fine, phobia is literally fear. But fear
Well,
manifests in different ways and stuff.
even if you put in the definition of a phobia being an intoleration or a bigotry towards the said person, it doesn't instantly mean that they are intolerant to the person as a person, just because they tease them as a joke. In fact, I hear this a lot from personal friends of mine. The only reason why they tease me is because they do like me. And if they didn't like me, they wouldn't tease me at all. Or they would like full out slander me if they hated me.
But can you see the difference between your friends and you joking about each other, like, and obviously still being friends, and like just transphobic jokes just being in general in society and normalized, and the allowance of transphobes to then get away with putting their like rhetoric and language in society? Like it extends beyond just the simple like, oh well, some of my friends are okay with it and stuff, and I've got contextually like examples of people being fine with jokes at their expense of this nature. It's bigger than that. And again, I use naive again because it is naive to sort of say, well, you don't just making a joke doesn't make you hateful towards the whole group. Like you're aiding
Yeah.
the views of those who are hateful towards this group. So it doesn't really matter what you are personally, because ultimately your contribution to the discourse is that you've allowed these transphobic views to be more legitimized.
Sticks and stones, man.
But it's not, is it though? Because like, yeah, fine, a
I
word
mean,
can't literally
the
destroy you.
person joking, that's like a sticks and stones situation. But the person who actually hates transgender people or even black people or any race of people, it's more of their ideology than what they actually say. Like they have the freedom of speech to say whatever they want of how much they hate said group. It's just a matter of whether or not we let them get away with their, or whether or not we let their ideologies be implemented, like the banning of transitioning or the banning of black people to go to the bathroom with white people,
But
and so on and so forth.
how do you think things reach that stage? Like they don't just instantly appear and say, right, we're going to ban all these things. They get normalized and they get accepted by a public which is unwilling to act. So again, to draw us back to the comparison of Nazi Germany, Hitler didn't just appear and like suddenly in 1933 say, oh, we're going to just erase all the non-whites and the Jews and stuff. They normalized their talking points by making propaganda, by making jokes, by making things, pushing slowly and tactically to normalize their agenda and their worldview. And it worked because too many people did nothing, and too many people legitimized their worldview by not doing enough, and eventually they won power. And it's the same thing here. Like we shouldn't be saying, "Oh, sticks and stones," and saying things like, "Oh, well, we have." It's just a word and stuff, and it's just jokes. When the end goal of the transphobes is to eliminate and remove trans people. I don't think it's again. I say I use
Eliminate
naive
what? Those
words
last
there.
few were garbled out.
Sorry.
You said were garbled out to legitimize what?
Sorry, legitimize the worldview of trans people. No, what am I saying? I was saying that transphobes are legitimized by the acceptance of their transphobic jokes. And it's naive to sort of say, oh, sticks and stones, because words and are the like obviously the expression of thoughts. And if enough people think that transphobia is acceptable, or if even worse, if enough people will do nothing whilst transphobia is going on,
I think that the normalization of a transphobic belief, of an anti-LGBT belief, is more concerning than the normalization of merely a joke.
But the jokes represent the transphobia. That's the whole point. Like, they need the jokes as just the entry, because it's harder, right, to say things like just openly being bigoted towards trans people than it is to hide and subvert your transphobia through humor. But at the same time, you're still normalizing it. You're just being clever about it, because you're finding the source of you're still pushing the source of your point, which is the transphobic like ideas about trans people, but you're normalizing it through humor and through comedy, which is why it's dangerous to have just transphobic jokes floating around. I don't feel as though you're fully like grasping the danger of sort of just allowing jokes to stand, which are like transphobic and stuff. Because yeah, fine, like a joke isn't as bad as like a some like racist, some Nazi going out and like beating a trans person in the street. But at the same time, like, what gives that transphobe the incentive and the motivation and the belief that they can get away with it to do that? It's the people who normalize and allow transphobic jokes to stand. And it's dangerous because trans people are at risk, as we're seeing in crime rates and stuff.
I guess you and I just have a little bit of a different worldview as far as the connection between freedom of speech, or speech in general, and ideologies, and the restriction of freedom.
But no one's saying freedom of speech is like being questioned here. But people should have consequences of what they say. So the person, people should be taught that no, transphobia is wrong, and these jokes.
Right. Teach them to be tolerant towards the person, but a parent can teach their kids that they can be lightened up and have a bit of a sense of humor, be it one that comes off as racist or transphobic, but at the same time teach those kids that we should not be restricting the liberties of said people.
But why? Like, why should trans people have to suffer all this humor like against them? Simply because
you use the word "suffer" again. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me.
But words do. Oh, I feel like we're going around in circles here. Like, words do contribute to harmfulness, though. Words are what you use to like convey messages, and if enough people believe the messages that the words convey, then it manifests in eventually harm. And as we're seeing, trans people are targeted, attacked, and killed for being trans, which is why it's incredibly like sort of naive, again, trying to think of a different word, but it's ignorant of the reality of the situation to just say, oh, well, sticks and stones, because all things start with words, and the words grow and the ideas get stronger until you end up with action. As with all, as with what history shows, like the Nazis didn't just appear and everyone just turned into Nazis. They pushed their worldview through words and through dialogue, and by normalizing their agenda. And eventually, they were able to seize control and then have the actions of the Night of Broken Glass and the burning of synagogues and obviously the final solution and stuff. Like, words is what it always starts as, and then it grows into action. So instead of allowing trans people to be the victims of more transphobia and even more abuse, we should say, no, we can stop this by addressing the ridiculous like transphobic jokes that exist in society, realizing they're just rubbish and they're not really even funny, because like if you're at core, they're just making fun of like trans people's status.
I don't know, Westman seems to laugh at my little tease at you.
Sorry?
I mean, that's not a transgender joke, and that's not the issue of transgenderism, but still, it's a similar subject in the fact that basically an ethnic minority group, LGBT people and black people in the Western world. That's how I would like say that is the equivalent to.
What? Sorry, are you so I'm a little bit lost. What did you say?
Sorry, I'm sorry. You said that trans jokes are not funny.
Well, if you break them down, if you actually think about where the humor's coming from, the
Well,
thing.
yeah, that's what you just said earlier, is that trans jokes are not funny or generally not funny. I can't remember the exact wording you said, but you said
Well, they
not
shouldn't
funny.
be funny, should they? Like, they shouldn't. If you think about what the joke is, it's not a particularly funny thing. Like, it's punching down at things that aren't even negative. So, like, where the humor's coming from transphobia, essentially. Is it not?
The transphobia is coming from a sense of humor, from a.
Sorry, the humor of the joke, like humor of a transphobic joke, is purely coming from the fact that a trans element has been introduced. The humor is derived from transphobia, because or transphobic views. So, for instance, whenever you see like a man in a dress joke, like what is that at core? That is just like the idea that someone you perceive to be a man in a supposedly female article of clothing is funny, when in fact no, that's not the case. What is actually funny about that? There's nothing like wrong about that. So the joke is only coming from transphobia at core, really. Like the whole point of the joke is transphobic. If we I get, obviously, yeah, it's when you hear these like things, it's like, oh well, I'm not transphobic just because I tell what's one trans joke. But if we actually break down the comedy and we analyze the joke, it's like well, yeah, it is, it's transphobia. So I think it's important to analyze these sort of things we're saying, hence why I feel as though transphobic jokes need to be sort of cut out, really, because like what's the point? All you're doing is aiding transphobes, and the joke itself is just transphobic, so like why bother? But did you just get like a message or something?
Yeah, I did. I was just silencing my phone right there. I'm gonna ignore it. So, what you said earlier, I want to recall back on this conversation a little bit. What you said earlier is that transphobic jokes, that trans jokes in general, is what leads up to a anti-transgender ideology, an anti-transgender ideology succeeding in a society.
I said it contributes to that. Like it's part of normalizing and enabling the transphobic views.
Well,
Even more
I would like to look on the other side of the coin of that, because I would think that a trans joke would also help develop somebody a thicker skin. Like, for example, I don't want to equivalate my Christian beliefs and my Christianship to transgenderism, but for a long time, I basically lived in myself an echo chamber, a Christian conservative echo chamber when I was a kid. I think we can say that generally, that all of us as a kid, we were either not politically involved or we pretty much just lived in an echo chamber. But anyway, I lived in an echo chamber and I did not hear hardly a single Christian joke for the longest time in my life. But then the more and more I got exposed to Christian jokes, I cannot name any off the top of my head, but they are out there on the internet. The more and more I got exposed to these, the thicker skin I got towards that, and even conservative jokes, for example, or white jokes, for that matter as well.
But can you see how in those cases, for the most part, the joke is punching up at groups that have traditionally had more power and being favored by society, whereas a trans joke is generally made against, like it's generally punching down and making fun of something which is like faced actual like more prescient like discrimination in society. I mean, you're looking pretty skeptical of that, but it's true. Like
making conservative Christian white male jokes is punching up, but making liberal black transgender jokes is pushing down.
I wouldn't say liberal, but can you see a
Well,
difference?
okay, not liberal. But I said conservative earlier. I thought it would only be fair to mention the opposite side of the political spectrum in the other case.
Not quite the opposite, I would say, but no, but
okay,
can you
fine.
see
A full-blown Marxist like yourself, Owen? Happy?
No, but no, seriously, can you see how with comedy, the like whole point is that you sort of punch up to make the joke funny. Otherwise, it's a little bit rubbish to punch down at marginalized groups. Like I'm not.
Not
I mean,
all the times a trans joke is going to be punching down.
like in what context is making fun of something trans, something about a transgender person that is trans, is going to be punching up? Like if that context doesn't exist in our society, sadly.
Okay. I cannot think of a transgender joke right off the top of my head that punches up, specifically one that you would think would be punching up, because all in all, senses of humor is subjective. I mean, you'll find different things funny that I won't find funny. I will find different things funny that you won't find funny, and
Oh, of course,
so on and
yeah.
so forth.
No, of course, yeah. Of course, humor is subjective. However, what isn't subjective is the sort of the context and the situation that trans people have faced. Like, if you go back a few decades, like, what were trans people even considered? Like, what were ideas like non-binary? They weren't allowed to be expressed because of the sort of nature of the world. It's a very recent part of history that we've even seen any sort of recognition and acceptance of trans people. And in fact, we still have pushback against that quite vehemently. So I feel as though just like portraying it as just, oh, senses of humor will always be different and you just got to allow some jokes is a little bit like, it's not particularly accurate.
So don't allow any jokes.
That's not what I said. Like, there are better jokes you can make than just like making jokes about trans people, especially when if you have like more empathy, you can see that it's not helpful at all to be making jokes which contribute to transphobia. Like, I feel as though there's more important things in the world than making jokes which aren't which are relatively flawed.
Well, of course, but we're only human, and we want to have some form of enlightenment and a sense of humor. A good sense of humor is one of the good ways to brighten up everybody's spirit. I mean, yes, it depends on the situation. Like, if you have some thin-skinned wimp, I mean, whoever it be, I'm not just saying specifically a transgender is a thin-skinned wimp, but anyone who's a thin-skinned wimp that does not like the joke being said around them, well, then that's the wrong situation. But I'm not.
I mean, I don't. Well, firstly, like, it's all very well saying people are thin-skinned wimps, but like, if you've lived in a society where your whole identity and like state of being has been sort of persecuted against and attacked and potentially like something you could be even killed for, then you can sort of understand why it's quite hurtful and like quite horrible to have jokes like this floating around. And secondly, what was I going to say? No, I can't remember the second thing I was going to say, but it's not quite the same thing, I think. Anyway, shall we sort of try to perhaps interject? Shall we move on to a different argument, or do you want to continue on this point?
No. I don't really have any more points to make regarding that subject.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we should just move on because we're kind of running in circles, and I've said pretty much all that I wanted to say. Have you said pretty much all that you wanted to say?
I feel as though, yeah, like, I agree. We're sort of going on in circles.
All right.